McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and along with my co-host, Jim Falk, we are very pleased to welcome back to a program an interesting individual talking about the most significant topic to you that matters because it affects everything you will do in your lifetime, business, personal, travel, and yes, whether you'll continue to survive in this kind of a world. So, Jim, why don't you introduce our guest?
I certainly will. Thank you, Dennis. And I'm so glad that Peter Zeihan could join us. He's a geopolitical strategist, and he combines a deep understanding of geography, demography, energy, and trade. And he's pretty good at picking winners and losers, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. The world has certainly become increasingly competitive and complicated, and Peter has devoted his whole career at analyzing the geopolitics. He's the author of 3 really thought-provoking books: The Accidental Superpower, The Absent Superpower, in his most recent book, Disunited Nations, The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World. And I understand as well, Peter, that you got a book that will be coming out in the next several months. So we'll be sitting on the couch waiting for that.
Me too.
I know. I think that's always the most challenging part for an author, to get from when you've submitted the manuscript to when it comes out and arrives at your house in the boxes.
Don't let the forecast happen too soon.
Exactly. Well, we had such a good conversation about a week ago, but I think it would be helpful today as we sort of bridge to today's program. Take 2 minutes or so and tell us what the order is and why you believe that it's essentially going to collapse.
Sure. At the end of World War II, the Americans changed the way the world works. Instead of different empires basically duking it out for populations and resources, we put everything to a big pool and we patrolled the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could play in any part of the world without having to militarize their economy. So they weren't shooting at each other, they could just go. And that generated the greatest economic growth we have ever seen in the history of our species. Now, we didn't do it because we're nice. We did it because it was a trade. You get globalization, you get free trade, you get access to the American market, and in exchange, the United States gets to write your security policies specifically to contain the Soviet Union. And that trade created the world that we know. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And for each of the last 4 successive presidential administrations in this country, we've moved further and further away. And now, functionally, it's over.
Well, your subtitle of your book, Disunited Nations, is The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World. And your life has been geopolitics, and most of our viewers understand very directly what geopolitics is, but there may be one person watching who's a little foggy about that concept. So talk to us a little bit about geography, particularly the things that you talk about with land, water, coastlines, et cetera, and how that has affected, but particularly is going to affect the future of the United States and other countries going forward.
Well, where you are, where physically you live is the single greatest factor that determines everything about your life. So if you live in a flatlands where they get ample rainfall, odds are you're very, very food secure, assuming you're not even a farmer. If you live along a river or at a major port, you're probably more integrated in the wider world and you're more culturally open to other ideas. That's one of the reasons why the hinterland in the United States it's part of why the hinterland in the United States is a little more conservative than the coasts. If you live in the mountains, you probably really don't like it when other people stick noses in your business, and you're probably fairly insular. And you add up factors like this, everything from your environmental circumstances to rainfall patterns to the heat patterns, and it shapes who you are. Now, one thing that has changed in the last 80 years is the United States has said it doesn't matter. With the global order, we said that everyone can play. And while some geographies are more economically viable than others, and so generate larger powers that become empires, with the global order, we smashed all of them and allowed everyone to play, no matter how weak the countries were. So it was no longer a world of Japan and Germany and Britain and France. It became a world full of places like Chile and Brazil and Spain and Italy and Libya, Syria and Vietnam. Without the Americans setting up the world in its current format, none of these small countries would have ever made it.
So in your book, you have chapters on about, I think, 12 different countries or so. Along with geography, demography plays a key role. What should we look at when we're analyzing a country's viability?
For demographics?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So think of a normal demographic profile as a pyramid with children on the bottom, young adults, retirees at the top, and mortality builds it into a pyramid. That's how it's looked more or less for the last 6,000 years. More people in their teens than 20s, than 30s, than 40s, than 50s, and 60s. But with the combination of industrialization, urbanization, and now the global order, people have been able to get a bigger chunk out of life for themselves. So they move from the farm into town, they get an apartment. And when space is constrained and you're packed in with a lot of other people, the birth rate drops. So you play that forward 80 years. And in most countries, we now have more people in their 50s than their 40s, than their 30s, than their 20s, than their 10s, than children. And so the whole world is turned inside out. For the countries that have aged like that, now that it's been decades, they're nearing the point where they have more retirees than workers. And when we hit that flip, their economies change. So if you have a lot of young people, it's all about the consumption. If you have a lot of mature workers, it's all about the production and the savings. And if you have if you're full of retirees, it's all about absolutely nothing because there's nowhere to grow. So what's going to happen in just the next 5 years is the world writ large flips from having a younger population of consumers and investors to a retiree population. And we have never seen that before in human history. To this point, only one country has crossed the Rubicon, Japan, and the Japanese economy today is the same size that it was in 1995.
And this is why you're not on the bandwagon that China is such a threat.
No, the one-child policy worked a little too well. And if you use Chinese statistics, which are always dubious and always designed to make China look better than it is, China is now the fastest aging society in human history. And they're already in their population collapse. And there will be less than half as many Chinese in the year 2070 as there are today.
And the three-child policy, I mean, which was recently announced, I mean, that's been met with great skepticism.
Yeah, and rightly so. They went from a one-child policy to a two-child policy a few years ago, and the birth rate went down. It's too late. They urbanized too quickly. Now, in the United States, our urbanization process has taken 7 generations to get where we are. So we've had time to adapt, and we have space for things like suburbs. So you can still have more than 2.1 children if you want to. That's not an option in China. They moved 3/4 of their population off the farm and into the cities in 35 years. So it's a single generation jump, and it just destroyed the birth rate.
And of course, your openness towards immigration, whether you're the United States or China, which certainly is not very open to immigration. Peter, why haven't you joined what I think is an increasingly large bandwagon of folks who worry a great deal about China, and yet you go so far as to say there'll be a broadside collapse of China?
Within the decade, most likely. Well, the first piece is demographic. They're now the fastest aging society in history. When they tried to go from the one-child policy to the two-child policy, their birth rate dropped because everybody was already in an apartment. It's been the fastest industrialization and the fastest urbanization in history. That generates growth once, and now it's over. We stretched our experience over 7 decades. They did theirs in 1, and it was fun while it lasted. Now it's gone. The Chinese Navy is constrained by the first island chain, and those are those islands off the coast of East Asia, so Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and so on, that they've never been able to punch through, except when the Americans are running the show and they force everyone to be on the same side. So if the Americans leave, that doesn't work. Because the Chinese demography is in free fall, they're completely dependent upon exports, which makes them economically the country in the world most dependent upon ongoing American involvement. This is a country that has almost mined out all of their resources, which makes them the single largest purchaser of every raw commodity in the world. But that requires open markets that are going away. This is a country that imports 80% of its energy, over half of which comes from the Persian Gulf and sales by no fewer than 11 countries that are pathologically hostile to the Chinese, not to mention that the Japanese have a blue water navy and China doesn't. There's nothing about this that works unless the United States holds up the ceiling. And we're done.
So what can China do to improve its situation?
Well, they can't improve the economic situation. Right now is as good as it will be in their lives. So what they're doing is they're preparing for lockdown. They're demonizing outsiders. They're persecuting people within their own country that might be brave enough to share a different opinion. That's part of the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing in Hong Kong and the genocide out in Xinjiang. They are preparing their system for a Maoist-style cultural revolution, political and economic disconnect from the rest of humanity. It's going to be ugly. It's going to result in the deaths of literally hundreds of millions of people. But the Communist Party is hopeful that if they can demonize the outside world enough, that they can hold power, and that's all they care about.
Well, and that was the subtitle of your book, is the power thing. Now, one of the things that you really focus on in your book that changed 30 years ago, and we talked about it in the previous program, was our relationship with the former Soviet Union, and today our relationship with Russia, which has its own issues. So you have in your book a sort of a forecast, and it's not particularly positive for Russia's future either. Tell us what you have to say about Russia.
Sure. So the entire purpose of the Cold War globalized order was to pay other countries to be on our side to contain the Soviets. It worked well. So the Soviets have always been leery of American leadership, especially when it comes to economic matters, because they just see it as a ploy to box them in, and they're not entirely wrong. I understand why they're paranoid. Oftentimes, Russian paranoia actually is rooted in a degree of fact, certainly in this case. But this is a country that doesn't have a good internal transport network. All the navigable rivers flow north into the Arctic, not any place where anyone would want to go. And the land is dry and the land is cold. So it's not very productive from an agricultural point of view. So Russia has always needed external investment and external technology in order to make its own system work at anything other than like a serfdom level. That's not really an option, especially when you look at their demographics. And between World War I and World War II and Soviet collectivization and the purges and the forced relocations and the post-Cold War health collapse, Russia had the fastest aging society in the world until Japan passed them up a few years ago. So this is a country that is also on its way out. Now, it doesn't have the economic vulnerabilities that China has. Because the Russians never invested their economy in the global system, when the global system goes away, they're more or less all right. Sure, they will lose resource sales, but militarily, they're in a reasonably good position. The problem is it's not good enough. Because the terrain is so open, Russian history is replete with examples of countries basically rolling in and invading. We know about the Germans. We know about the Swedes, we know about the Chinese, we know about the Persians and the Mongols, but people forget that countries like Canada invaded Russia at one point. I mean, it's not a hard place to get a foothold in. Poland almost conquered Moscow once. So while no one is thinking, oh, I want to march on Moscow right now, the Russians can't take that chance because it's happened so many times before. So if you've got a terminal demography and no real economy, the only thing that you can do to buy yourself more time is take your army while it's still functional and forward position it and plug the geographic gaps that access your lands. So the Carpathians form a border. You anchor there, but that means conquering Ukraine and half of Poland and the Balts. You go south and anchor in the Tianjin, but that means conquering Kazakhstan and the Central Asian republics. So this is something that Russia can do and is working on doing with as much diplomacy and arm twisting as it can. But at the end of the day, they're going to have to use troops. And if they do this, and if it works, then Russia buys itself another 30 years, which honestly is more time than China has.
Well, I promise all of you we're going to get to some winners in a minute, but first let's talk about the Middle East, where we have seemed to be quite unable to withdraw.
Actually, I would argue we have. We, courtesy of the Trump administration, got down to fewer than 20,000 troops in the area, and under Biden, we're going to go to 0 by the end of September. So we are close to there. Now, whether you think that's a brilliant idea or a horrible one is, of course, based
So
on
where
your
does the
reading
Middle
of
East, though?
region.
Where do countries like Saudi Arabia fit in, as well as Iran?
Well, Saudi Arabia has long depended upon the United States' largesse, both in terms of oil purchases and military defense, in order to make itself exist. I mean, this is a country that doesn't have an economy outside of the oil markets, and this is a country that doesn't have the military capacity to patrol its own streets, much less its borders. So as the United States pulls back, the Saudis are having an oh crap moment, and they're trying to figure out what to do. So the solution seems to be to stir up as much trouble among as many rivals as possible, so that they're busy putting out fires on their side of the desert borders to Saudi Arabia's north. So Yemen is kind of target practice for their air force. They've discovered they're not very good at it. But ISIS is a great example of the sort of institution that the Saudis are creating to cause problems for other countries, so those other countries can't target Saudi Arabia. So ISIS cost them almost nothing, and it stirred up the region for 7 years. Low cost, very effective. They're trying the same thing in Iran, in Chechnya. They tried the same thing with Russia in the past. They're trying the same thing in the Levant, not targeting the Israelis, targeting the groups that are targeting the Israelis. The Israelis and the Saudis get along splendidly, and they think about as highly of everybody else in the region as they think of each other.
Well, and they both gang up or see as an enemy Iran. So where does Iran fit in, say, 5-10 years from now?
5-10 years from now, we're going to probably have a very different opinion about Iran. Now, most of the bad blood between the Americans and the Iranians, of course, dates back to the 1979 revolution and the hostage crisis.
Absolutely.
But if you look at the 50 years of history before that, we got along pretty well with the Persians because we trusted them more than we trusted the Arabs. Remember that the crown prince of Saudi Arabia right now, this is the guy who sent a hit squad to kill a journalist and then ordered them to cook it to nothing in a brick oven out in a courtyard of the embassy, and then hosted a party for 500 people to destroy the forensic evidence. These are not nice people. And with a little bit of perspective, you have the Saudis throwing terror attacks around the region for a few years, and you have Iran functionally cut out of the oil markets for a few years. The United States is probably going to look at this whole region a little bit differently. I don't mean to suggest that we're going to get back in bed with the Iranians anytime soon, but I think we're going to have a little bit more nuanced view of the region when it comes to Israel versus Saudi Arabia versus Iran than we do right now. And ultimately, the country that has to kind of pick up where we left off and make sense of this, that's Turkey. And they're a country that is very capable of doing that. But just like everybody else in the world, they would rather the Americans do it. And it's not until we're completely gone that they're going to realize that it's either they do it or it's done to them.
We have talked about a lot of different countries, and you have very interesting things to say about Europe, particularly Germany, which most people see as positive. France, people like me see as a great place to go and visit or live or something. But give us your thoughts on both of those countries and how that affects all of Europe, basically.
Germany is an interesting place. We all know it, of course, from history, is one of the more warlike places because they're in the middle of everything and they have to be aggressive if they're going to survive. If they wait for someone else to move first, they will always be outnumbered and outgunned and surrounded. But then World War II happened and they were forcibly reconstructed by the Allies. And so Germany today is neo-pacifist. And their general feeling is if it becomes a military competition, we've already lost. So they want to keep the competition economic and financial so that their larger size, their better geography, their more economically viable firms can dominate. And in the world of the global order, that's a good play. Because if the Americans are outlawing war in Europe and are protecting the Europeans from the Russians and from one another, then the military question isn't even on the table. And in that environment, the Germans have restructured their entire system to maximize benefit. and it's worked very, very well. And that's why Germany is the Germany that we think of, the Germany of industry and exports and manufacturing. But if you remove the Americans from that equation, it all goes to hell. And the only way that Germany continued to exist is by putting the military question back on the table and looking out for its own interests. And the last 11 times that has happened, it has ended badly. France is on the flip side. At the end of World War II, France was the least interested country in what the Americans were offering with the order, because like the United States, they've got a great geography. They've got navigable rivers, fantastic farmland, good local resources, access to the Mediterranean. This is a country that has been a world power for the last several centuries without any help, thank you very much. And then the Americans came in and said, you know, geography doesn't matter. Everyone can play. And in that world, everything that made France special ceased to matter. But now remove the Americans. All of a sudden, geography comes back with a vengeance. And unlike the Germans who retooled everything, the French retooled nothing. So this state-managed economic system that we see as a negative right now in a post-globalized world, that's the way to go in Europe. And they never changed anything. They also happen to have the second most powerful military in all of Europe, the second largest army after Turkey, the second largest navy after the UK. They are no joke. And unlike the United States, when it hits a certain casualty level in its conflicts, it tends to pull back. The French go in hard. They are extraordinarily unapologetic. They're almost American in their foreign policy. And so if you just fast forward a few years, Western Europe is France's playground. And Germany has to find a new way to operate.
Of course, that's what Macron's been trying to do, president of Europe. We've been hopscotching around the world quite a bit, but let's go to India. Is India a winner?
It depends on how you define that word. I don't think India is going to have any kind of the problems like Russia or Germany. Its demography is broadly stable and young. So they're a consumption-led system with 1.5 billion people. That's relevant, and that's not going away. In addition, they're the first stop for shipments out of the Persian Gulf. So they'll never have an energy crisis, which is something that China is just going to have to learn to live with day after day after day. And as the East Asian manufacturing system and the Chinese system breaks down, India, at a minimum, is going to have to make the stuff that it consumes itself. Even if it doesn't export anything, manufacturing for 1.5 billion people, that's a lot of business. India doesn't have to be globally involved to be globally relevant. But on the flip side, most capital generation comes from transporting goods from one point to the other. And in India, none of the rivers are navigable, so it all has to be dragged around by truck. So in per capita terms, India is the poorest country in financial resources in the world. But it's been like this for 1,500 years. It's not going to change just because the world ends. So if you want India to like turn the corner and be this glowing, glorious thing, no, it's been 1,500 years. It's not going anywhere. But if you think that India is going to fall apart because global trade does, no, it's looked like this for 1,500 years. It's going to be just fine.
You use a word in your book that describes what you see as the future, and that's overwhelming. So tell us what you meant by overwhelming, and then give us just a short taste of what your new book is going to be about and what the title of it is, which already makes me nervous.
I am overwhelmed by the scale of the changes we're going to be experiencing in the next decade. We've known that the floor is going to fall out of global demography for the last decade. We know that we've been living in this blessed period of the late order where everyone has access to everything, and we have all these young people and all these mature adults in the market at the same time, and we know that's going to go away. There's nothing we can do to change that. So we're going to go from the most artificial period in history to something that's a lot more normal. And the world before 1945 is a little scary, and now we have to do it without consumers and investors. So yikes. That's where the next book picks up. The provisional title is Life After the End of the World, and where Disunited goes through and talks about the future of Brazil and India and Russia and the United States as countries. Life After the End of the World will do the same thing for the economic sectors, transport and energy and finance and industrial commodities and manufacturing, and show what they're going to look like on the backside of all this change.
Well, having read your latest book, Disunited Nations, it's not all doom and gloom. Tell us why should we get out of bed tomorrow if we're in the United States?
Well, the United States economy was never invested in the world. If we had, it wouldn't have been the bribe that brought everybody else to the yard. Just as important, the United States has the youngest demography in the developed world. And Mexico has the youngest demography in the advanced developing world. So while everybody else has got to figure out how to work without capital supplies and how to work without consumers, in the United States and Mexico, even if we continue aging at our current rate, that's not a problem for us until at least the 2060s. We've got something that no one else in the world has in preparing for the future: time.
Peter, I know people are going to want to follow you. Tell us your Twitter handle and where we can get all your posts.
Sure. The Twitter handle is just my name, @peterzeihan.com, Zeihan. And if you go to my website, which is zeihan.com, you can sign up for the newsletter, which will always be free, although I will warn you, I am an equal opportunity bubble popper. So if you're convinced that Antifa was behind the January 6 attacks or that Elizabeth Warren has any idea what she's talking about, it might not be what you want to follow.
Well, we certainly want to thank you for being on our program. In fact, 2 programs. And if you missed our earlier program, you can catch up by going to McCuistionTV.com. You can see our first program with Peter Zeihan, and you can also watch all of our other programs. You can follow Dennis and me on Twitter or your favorite social media. And remember, we're here talking about perceptions that matter with people who care. Thanks again for watching.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at nikkimcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.